is video number 5 for term sheet 1, and we're still in week 1. So we're going to go over cavities. What do I mean when I say cavity? A cavity is just an area inside of the body that's separated from other areas with a membranous sac referred to as a serous membrane. So serous membranes can sometimes surround individual organs, such as in the case of the heart, which we'll talk about, or in the case of the lungs, or it can encase an entire region. So you can see that there's kind of this delineation of this entire area off here, and that's actually bound in a membrane enclosed sac. So that's what a cavity is, and you got to be able to identify them on a model. So let's start off here. First off, we have something referred to as the posterior aspect or the dorsal cavity. Now, it's difficult to see the dorsal cavity in these kinds of models. You can kind of see here. But the dorsal cavity encompasses where the brain's being held all the way down through the vertebra. Okay, so that's all of that there is considered to be the dorsal cavity or the posterior aspect. You can break that cavity, that larger cavity, and so in other words, this whole thing in here, the brain and the spinal cord and all that stuff is encased in one membranous sac, okay? And you can break that down into smaller regions. We have the cranial cavity, so in other words, the brain has its own membranous sac that's separating it off from other things. And we also have the vertebral cavity. The vertebral cavity is also going to have its own membrane-bound sac, okay? So they are cavities within their own right within the larger cavity. Moving on, we're going to talk about the ventral cavity. So the ventral cavity, this is shown really well here. It squeaks, I'm sorry. But the ventral cavity is going to be encompassing everything in here. So whenever I think ventral, I think of the word vital, and that makes me think about just organs in general. So ventral is just everything in here. In other words, there's a one big, large membranous sac that contains everything. That ventral cavity can be broken down further. First, we have the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity, if you remember, the thoracic region is going to be basically up in here where your lungs and your heart are. So this whole region here is bound, again, by a membranous sac. That's your thoracic cavity. Within the thoracic cavity, we can further subdivide that down. Before I was talking about how the heart has its own membrane-bound sac, that's going to be called the pericardial cavity. And you can actually see in here that we have a whole cavity, a whole hole here for the heart. And you can see on this particular model, if I bring it up close, you can actually see some of that membrane there starting to come up and around the heart. So that's its own cavity, okay? Above the pericardial cavity, we have the superior mediastinum cavity. And I may be going out of order on these, so sorry about that in advance, just kind of going as I think about them. But the superior mediastinum cavity encompasses the tubes up here, essentially. So above the heart, we have its main artery, the aorta, and we also have the main vein, that being the superior vena cava, and we also have the trachea, and I have the esophagus back there. So all these tubes are also encapsulated in their own membrane, okay? And that is the superior mediastinum cavity. Unfortunately, you can't see that really very well in here, or else I would show that to you. We also have in the thoracic cavity the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity is a cavity that surrounds both lungs. It's negatively pressured, which helps to keep the lungs inflated. So that's kind of cool. Pleural, I always think because there's two lungs. Don't spell it like the word plural, though. It's P-L-E-U-R-A-L. Okay? So in here you can actually kind of see, if I turn this a little bit, that there's the start of this white kind of membrane here that's surrounding the lungs. That's going to be your pleural cavity serous membrane. Okay. Moving on down. So down here. So again, this whole thing here is the ventral cavity. We had the thoracic cavity up here with its several cavities contained within that. Down here, from below the lungs or at the diaphragm, which you guys will learn about way later, down to here we have the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into two more cavities. First, we have the abdominal cavity, so that's up here, and that contains most of your vital organs, so liver, kidneys, stomach, etc. So that's going to be your abdominal cavity. And then you can further subdivide the abdominal pelvic cavity from the abdominal cavity, also here the pelvic cavity. And you can actually see that it's its own individual cavity. That's where you're going to have urinary and reproductive stuff. So I thought this one kind of shows it a little bit. So you can see in here, here's the bladder, so obviously that's going to be down your pelvic cavity. And if you look on the top of the bladder here, you can see a hint of that membrane that's separating the pelvic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Okay. I just thought this was really nice. This also shows really nicely here the division of the abdominal pelvic area or cavity from the thoracic cavity. So this is a really nice model for showing cavities, as is this one because you can actually make out the membranes. So if I want to test you on cavities, these are probably the models that will depend on the practical. So yeah, so that's your cavities.